Good morning, Chamber friends. Molly Grover with the Dubuque Area Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to our October Power Hour. It's a beautiful Tuesday morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Hoping this message and this program finds all of you and your families and your colleagues safe and well. We're so thrilled to be able to have this program. We offered it in 2018, the theme of this program, Political Analysis and Predictions. And we were sharing before we got started, in 28, we thought that was a strange year. And certainly now in 2020, makes 2018 look like child's play. But we're interested to hear from our experts today. And we've invited political experts across the state, some of them here locally, some of them from in the Des Moines area. Of course, Dustin Miller, you're going to meet him in a few minutes. He is the executive director of ICA, in addition to what he does full-time as well. And we're so excited to have this panel, a nonpartisan panel here to share their thoughts, their feedback about the political atmosphere, the elections coming up. And we have really great questions planned for you. This event, Power Hour, is due to the generous support of sponsors. So we have Statera Integrated Health, we have Anderson Window and Door, we have I'm On Communications, and the Friedman Group. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Mr. Scott D'Souza, who's the president of the Friedman Group, as our facilitator today. So with that, I turn it over to Mr. Scott D'Souza. Scott.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Molly, and thanks for the Dubuque Area Chamber of Commerce for putting this on. And thank you, everyone, for joining our October virtual Power Hour. As Molly mentioned, my name's Scott D'Souza. I'm the president of the Friedman Insurance Group, along with the other sponsors, Anderson Window and Door, I'm On Communication, and Statera Integrated Health and Wellness. We're excited that you chose to spend some time with us this morning for today's presentation. Power Hour is really an opportunity for us all to gain valuable insight from informative presentations on today's hottest new topics, and this is a hot topic, obviously. As a perk of being a sponsor, the Power Hour allows us to do a little 1-minute commercial, and the Friedman Insurance Group has been around since 1928. We are primarily a business insurance, commercial insurance provider. Our tagline's always been protecting what's important to you. And since 1928, we've been through not a pandemic, I would say, every 10 years, but we've been through a lot of struggles with our customers. And I think the most important thing that we've provided is information. Never did we think we'd be providing information on how to handle anxiety and how to handle depression with the workforce and a pandemic and how to handle COVID. But from our humble beginnings in 28 till today, it's still about our customers and it's still about protecting what's most important to you. So thank you again, Dubuque Chamber, for putting this on. For today's Power Hour, we're bringing you a political analyst panel to give some insight into the coming elections. The panel is made up of Mr. Dustin Miller, Associate Attorney at Nyemaster Goode PC, Andy Conlin, a Principal of Conlin State Strategies, and Mr. Christopher Budzisz, Ph.D., Associate Professor of Politics at Loras College. We have a list of questions that we provided our panel, but let's please use the chat function, if you will, to submit any questions. And if you have time, if we have time at the end, we'll get to that. So without any further ado, let's get started. And since Andy is in my left corner of my laptop, we'll start with him. Our first question, Andy, is the presidential election is a little less than a month away. Can you provide a general summary of what the national polling and Iowa polling data currently says?
Yep, I'm happy to do that. First of all, to all of you on the line, I appreciate the opportunity to come in and say hello. I think from a national perspective, it's pretty clear that Biden has got a lead in the public polls. He's had a pretty durable lead for most of the campaign cycle. I think a lot of folks are focusing on the national polls where Biden's lead is a little bit larger than perhaps Hillary Clinton's was. When I look at this, I look at some of the swing state or the battleground polls. One of the things that I think the Trump people are probably excited to hear and are excited about is if you look at the main battleground states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, North Carolina, and Arizona, and note I'm leaving off Iowa for now. In those states, Trump is actually performing a little bit better in 20 relative to his 2016 number. On the flip side of that, though, there are fewer undecideds. If you look at all of those states in 2016, Hillary Clinton in the public polling never got above 50% in any of those states. And Biden is at 50 or at 49.9 in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which is not a great place to be. I would say from something else I'm watching that's in addition to the polling is I'm watching very closely where the battlegrounds are playing out, not only on the presidential side, but also on the US Senate side, which I think is particularly informative because I think in a lot of ways, the presidential is going to work kind of in tandem with the US Senate race. And I think we've seen that in Iowa to a certain degree with the public polling. If you're the Republicans right now, you want to be talking about Maine, you want to be talking about Colorado, you want to be talking about Michigan. And I think from a Republican perspective, I just saw yesterday that they're making an independent expenditure in Alaska. They're active in South Carolina. The Democrat running against Senator Graham down there reported as raising $57 million last quarter, which is a huge number. And they're also engaged in Kansas. So those are places where Republicans don't necessarily wanted to be operating at this point. And I think it shows that the environment's probably a little bit tougher than it was 4 years ago. One other thing, though, on all of that, and I don't want to monopolize too much time, but I think it's an important point as we do our rank punditry here. It's important to remember that I was reminded that this weekend was actually the 4-year anniversary of the Access Hollywood tape that came out in 2016. So that's a way of saying that while this is where all of these polls are today, I think one of the things that we've learned in the era of President Trump is, we've got 20 some odd days, but there's probably 60 some odd news cycles between now and election day. So there's a lot that we still have to see.
Okay. Thank you. Chris, can you, again, the presidential election is less than a month away. Can you provide a general summary of what, and maybe you can dovetail onto Andrew, what the national polling and Iowa polling currently is saying?
Sure, and like Andrew, I want to thank the Chamber and the sponsors for this opportunity. So it's always great to come together with the Chamber and with colleagues to discuss these topics. In terms of polling, I would just echo much of what Andrew said. I think what is really kind of interesting is looking at these kind of questions of what polling might miss. There's lots of discussion here, especially in the upper Midwest, about what polling missed. In a previous life, I still do a little polling, but previous life, I did some presidential polling as well as statewide and congressional. And I do think there's still a little bit of caution amongst pollsters, especially in the upper Midwest, around what to do with things like weighting of whites without college degrees. So what's really fascinating about the environment right now with the polling is it's incredibly stable. So while I completely agree with Andrew, there'll be 60 news cycles. We've had 60 news cycles in the last week or two, and they don't really seem to move the needle particularly much. So it's a really fascinating kind of feature of a Trump presidency. So I wonder how much really is already kind of baked in terms of people's perceptions of things. Yeah, the national average is hovering around 10%. In Iowa, it's on average, it's Biden +1 or a tie. So it's a really tight environment. Looking at polling in states like Wisconsin or Michigan, I do think what you're seeing is that the splits amongst males versus females, those with college education or without college education, these are widening gaps. So I think what you're going to see in some of this polling as we go forward is probably a tightening in some of these states. But it's a tough environment for Republicans nationally for sure. But I think the state picture is a little more is more complicated, especially states like Pennsylvania, Iowa for that matter, is very close. So that's all I would. That's kind of what I would add to that.
Okay, Dustin, do you want to chime in on that as well? Your feeling on the polling?
Yeah, and I would agree with a lot of things that both Chris and Andy said. couple things that I would add to that, and it sounds like all of us agree that the national polling I don't take a whole lot from. The only thing I would say is in 2008, President Trump got, or candidate Obama got 53% of the national vote. In 12, he got 51, and then Secretary Clinton underperformed at 56%. So, or excuse me, 48%. So that's something I watch because everything that Chris and Andy just said is important for the battleground states, just mechanically where you get the votes from. It's been talked about a lot that Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, those three states were won all by less than 1% of the vote, 77,000. So in addition to everything that Andy and Chris said, especially, I try and watch the individual polling in each state. Also, I take a look at the unfavorables because what happened in 2016 is you had two of the most unfavorable candidates in history. And you really don't have that as much. I don't think it's an accident that you're seeing Secretary Clinton's name brought up again in political circles because it is tough to make a dent in the unfavorable side. And one other interesting thing that I'm watching is uptick in COVID in comparison to these battleground states. Again, I think what Chris said is pollsters are very careful right now, but at the same time, that they're trying to track what's going on. If people are seeing a larger uptick, the polls seem to move as well, interestingly enough. And last but not least, I also have been listening to quite a few podcasts and that, and I take a lot from Dave Wasserman, who's with the Cook Report. He was the first one in 2016 to really say in September that Trump has a path. And as both Andy and Chris have said, it's really favorable to Biden. But I don't think until the votes are counted, anybody should say that the president is out.
Okay. Dustin, I'll start with you. Our next question, speaking platforms and not personalities, what are the key priorities for each national party?
Well, I mean, I think it's we've gotten in this stage of electoral politics of painting broad strokes. So it's really what each other is trying to paint of one another. Republicans, you're hearing a lot about law and order because of trying to paint Democrats with defund the police. You'll hear a lot about health care, out of control abilities to maintain, COVID responses. But I would say, at least with what I've seen at the national level, which is very different, as these guys have both said, which is different than the state level, it's really kind of coming down to a COVID response in healthcare, which I think they're obviously seeing something in the polls about those things because it's something people are talking about regularly.
Okay. Chris, same question. Speaking platforms and not personalities, what do you think are the key priorities for the parties?
Right. I guess when I first read this question, I thought it was kind of funny because the Republicans actually don't have a 2020 platform. So the question mentions platform, and actually because of COVID and because of the changes in the convention, the Republicans just basically adopted the 2016 platform. In fact, they have a one-page proclamation that we didn't have a platform committee, so we're essentially going with 2016. So I think it's just a kind of interesting note, a telling sort of sign of a pandemic age is that it's even impacted how parties conducted their conventions and conducted their business around things like platforms. So when we do look at what's out on the stump and what's being played out in the ads, I echo what Dustin would say, what Dustin said. I do think that the interesting thing about it is how, at least from the presidential level, how muddled message is, right? So in the Trump era, it's, I think, been a very difficult trick for some Republicans. I think Senator Ernst is seeing this, of this idea of discussing things in a traditional way in a Trump environment in which he kind of is throwing curveballs and they're having to react to those and they become issues. So I think this morning, President Trump went after Dr. Fauci again in a kind of spat regarding, COVID and his, things like that. Those type of events kind of, I think, make it difficult to conduct what we tend to call like message discipline. It's an environment that can be very difficult, but I think that's kind of Trump's forte, the way he approaches things like that. So yes, COVID on the Democratic side, COVID, race issues, so racial injustice, social justice issues. Climate change has been less of an issue than probably it would have been with other central presidential candidates. The court issue, but honestly, that one's more of a motivation for bases rather than for, average voters who are not that ideologically committed. And on the Republican side, yes, law and order, the economy, economic growth issues like that. And then really this cultural and social values issues that oftentimes are discussed under a kind of umbrella about, what America means, things like that. So I think that's where it is, but certainly healthcare, COVID response, and that I think has been beneficial for the Democrats by and large.
Okay. Andrew, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, let me just add a couple of things. I think, first of all, I agree with everything that's been said so far. So I just want to take a little bit of a different angle and just mention a couple of other additional things that are on my mind. First of all, more specifically in terms of COVID is the COVID relief package and what that looks like. Whether that gets done between now and Election Day, whether that gets done, which is looking increasingly unlikely, or whether it gets done in a lame duck, or whether it gets done in a new Washington starting in January. I think that's something that a lot of businesses are looking for, because I think, particularly the airlines, hospitality, restaurants are all looking for cash infusions to help keep them going in the era of COVID, particularly as we go into the winter. This is also a very big deal for state and local governments. And that's one of the main sticking points at this point. There are literally hundreds of billions of dollars in between the Republican Senate position and the House position, and I think getting to the bottom of that is going to be a really big priority, regardless of who wins. And I think the other thing that I would just mention, and this is something that really the Republicans are spending an awful lot of time talking about as kind of a base motivator, but it came up in large part because some of what's happening in the Dem base is the future of the filibuster and what that looks like from a legislative perspective. Because if there is a change in the filibuster, either with regard to particularly policy, but also whether it goes away or it's incrementally ratcheted down, you could see the window of opportunities that are available to the majority expand. All of a sudden, bills that wouldn't be able to survive in a threshold of 60 vote environment, all of a sudden are a little more viable, and that. The Republicans are using that as a cudgel. You're hearing things like eliminate the filibuster, court packing, and that's a really big talking point for President Trump. But on the other hand, you're hearing from both sides of the Democratic coalition talking about whether we have to do this because the Republicans are packing the court with conservatives, or on the flip side, whether we can't do this because the Senate is an institution we need to preserve. So I just think, in addition to COVID and healthcare, these are some of the other ancillary issues that are kind of floating around out there.
Okay, thank you. We've kind of talked nationally now more close to home in Iowa. And Chris, I'll start with you with this. What do you believe are the current defining issues in Iowa, and what does that mean for candidates and incumbents?
Okay, so in Iowa itself, it used to be, I think that we were able to stand apart a little bit in terms of the national discussions. We tend to send mixed delegations to Congress and the rest, and at some level we managed to I think keep at bay polarization. So this growing split and divide between left and right, Republicans and Democrats, and nary the twain shall meet type of thing. So there's greater and greater pressure to polarize, and I do think you've actually seen evidence now that that's kind of weakening. And what I mean by that is the national picture is bleeding into the state picture more and more and more. So for instance, this will be the first election in a long time where we're going into it where no party registrants are actually, not the large number that they used to be. They're declining. So in the state of Iowa, you have a declining number of no party voters in terms of registration. So that's been an interesting issue. And I think with that, you've seen a lot of the discussions at the state level kind of start mirroring more and more the national discussions, a kind of nationalization of politics. But there's still some things that are kind of unique. The biofuels industry is one thing that you'll definitely see a discussion of. I know Senator Ernst is definitely trying to run with that message. Things like trade as it relates to farming. So the agricultural sector is a major component here. Same thing with alternative fuels and energy. So those are things that you see candidates trying to talk about, as well as a kind of cultural notion about Washington being a distant place. That kind of theme is always something you see there. I do think that with COVID, I completely agree with Andrew. Part of the notion of COVID response simply isn't the mitigation from an epidemiological standpoint, but rather also the stimulus, which I know places in Iowa are very much, they're waiting to see more action, both from Des Moines, but also especially from DC, where that money really is. So I think economic issues, especially as it relates to trade, biofuels are particular to Iowa a little bit more than some other states. The economy in Iowa it tends to be a little bit better than in some of these other states. So I think that economic message is more about continuing a pattern of growth, that type of thing. But I really do think, kind of like Dustin was mentioning Hillary Clinton, I think if you were dropped in from space, didn't know anything about it, you would likely think that Trump is running, half the time Trump is running and national Republicans are running against Hillary Clinton again, because it's mentioned so often. And so I do think there's a Trump referendum on the other side, meaning, whether it's outside money or the rest, they're trying to paint this, well, in Iowa, the issue really is, Trump, right? And so they're trying to make that kind of a prevailing issue. But on the other side, Republicans trying to tie this to the kind of legacy Obama, Clinton, and Biden is essentially just an empty suit. He's being controlled by others. So I think that's language you also see in the message here in Iowa, but that's also reflective in the national picture.
Okay, thank you. Dustin, what do you think are the defining issues and some of the defining issues in Iowa?
Yeah, and again, I agree with a lot of what Chris said. I think, what's really interesting on the issue side of things is I think since 2010, the Republican Party and I think Democratic Party folks in Iowa would look and say, okay, is Iowa looking more like Arkansas, and where it used to be once a very purple state trending much more red? And this goes back to something Chris said on the last question too, is I think culturally and demographically, what Iowa is, outside of some of the major metros, the cultural divide in the country is very real. And I've said this about the gun issue for years too. I think the gun issue a lot of times is much more rural urban than it is politics. And I think it's people who, and I'm from a little tiny town, and I spend a lot of time there in southern Iowa. And yeah, it's people just don't feel understood. And to things that Andy and Chris have said, it isn't about the policy. It's about not feeling understood and somebody saying it like it is. And so I think those cultural things will be very interesting to see. And there locally, I don't want to skip too far ahead on you, Scott, but there locally, what was really fascinating to me is in preparing for this, I looked at the districts for Representative Lundgren and Representative McKean, and the swings in those districts are fascinating between 2012 to 16 and even the 2018 election between the governor, and then for Democrats, I think what they want to look at is the state auditor race and Rob Sands' performance. And even in 2018, you saw Governor Reynolds getting 58% in both of those districts. And then swinging over to the auditor race on the same ballot, people were going 50% for the Democrat, both of them, identical numbers. And so that's the really kind of defining issues is, the polarization is real, as Chris mentioned. And it's I think one of the things I'm really looking at twofold. Chris mentioned the agricultural issues. The ethanol industry has just been really beat up for 4 years. And even with those waivers not being approved recently, it's still the amount of gallonage that's been lost is big. And a lot of those plants are still shut down. So does that impact people personally or culturally? Are they still going to say, no, I'm rural and I think he's part of me? Similar on the trade side, but the trade has been kind of buffeted by some payments from USDA to agricultural producers. That's something that is very interesting to me in 4 years' time to see how people react. And the other one is the law and order. Over the weekend, you saw Senator Ertz, talking about that, suburban moms wanting to be safe. And this is just my own, I have no science behind it, but I think 2018, to me, and I love Iowa. I know Andy loves Iowa, but both he and I have lived in larger cities, and I love the fact that our state is a state of small towns. And so to me, 2018, what was really interesting is clearly Democrats were targeting the old suburban wall for Republicans and cracked through. But in Iowa, we still are a bunch of small towns. And so where those kind of national things poured down was really kind of limited to the Omaha area and Council Bluffs and the Des Moines suburbs. So it'll be interesting to see if that kind of continues to stay for 2020 or if that floats through. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, and Andy, if you could add anything.
Yeah, let me just add a couple of kind of specific things. First of all, I think if you ask on the issue specifically, if you ask Republicans, what is your message this cycle? Iowa Republicans, state level Republican types, what they would tell you is that we had the best economy in the country. COVID came, destroyed the whole thing, and we can put it back on track with an agenda that is free, that'll make you freer and more fair. I think if you ask the Democrats the same question, what they would tell you is that government doesn't care about you. The governor botched the COVID response and didn't go far enough. We don't have the mask mandates. We have businesses that need more support. And I think they would also say, and this is a systemic problem that we've seen with Medicaid and with the tax cuts. And so government just doesn't care about you. I think that's the playing field that each of the state level parties want to operate under. I think what is to Dustin's point, I think it'll be interesting to see if what has become the 2016 Forward Coalition is going to hold on. I think if you talk to Governor Reynolds' people, what they would tell you is that as they were watching numbers come in 2018, they were very concerned about the numbers that they saw in Polk County, because historically Republicans need to hit a certain threshold in Polk County to be viable statewide. But then all of a sudden you started to see the numbers come in from Northwest Iowa, and the governor blew it out with the rural vote and was able to beat Mr. Hubble. And I think that you saw something similar, but to a lesser degree in 2018 or 2016. In full disclosure, before I launched my own lobbying firm, I was chief of staff to President Charles Schneider, who represents President of the State Senate, who represents West Des Moines, Clive, Windsor Heights, and Waukee. And in that election, Donald Trump was overperformed by Senator Schneider, a state-level state senator, by just about 13 points. So you started to see that shift. And this is in a state that President Trump won by 9. So you started to see that shift then. I think that shift manifested itself again in 2018, although to a lesser degree, because you saw higher turnout in the suburbs voting against Republicans. And I think as we go into 2020 here, the question is, how is that going to break out, and what is that turnout model going to look like? And that's something I'm watching closely.
Okay, sticking with Iowa. What is your, and Andrew, we'll start with you on this one. what is your analysis and prediction, if you will, regarding our race, the first congressional district race between incumbent Abby Finkenauer and candidate Ashley Hinson?
Okay. So a couple things are on my mind for that race. First of all, the president is, if you look at the public polling, the president's running about 10 points behind where he was in 2016. That's a problem for the congressional races, frankly. In 2016 to 2018, in the first congressional district, Abby Finkenauer overperformed relative to the 2016 number by 12.5 points. So if the president's doing worse, if Representative Finkenauer is doing that well, I think it's going to be a tough race. I do think that Ashley Hinson is a really good candidate. She's working really hard. She's got a lot of national support. But I think right now, if I had to bet Dustin's money, I would bet that Abby Finkenauer is probably well positioned to win.
Okay, Chris, your take on that race?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Andrew. I do think one of the things that the Republicans were really looking to do when they came into this cycle was candidate recruitment. I think they did a good job, especially in the first district with Hinson, given her name recognition, her young female candidate, so that fits a demographic that the party was hoping to expand into. It's been a tough road. And one thing I would note about the first district, if you look at a lot of the counties that comprise the first district, Republicans have done better at narrowing the registration gap in the first district. That's absolutely true. But this is to a previous point that Dustin made, this is a pretty swingy district. It's one of those pivot counties, right? That goes for Obama twice and then swings over to Trump. I do think Finkenauer it's a good environment for Finkenauer. So if I was going to bet both Andrew and Dustin's money, I would put it with Finkenauer. But that does, if you start looking at the congressional races across the state, it does provide an interesting picture, because if you think Finkenauer is going to do well in the first, and Axne at least is polling well, and you'd think that's a good kind of environment for the third district, I completely agree that the fourth district on the west end of the state is going to go even further for Trump. What does that all mean when you add this together, and what's happening in the second, which is an interesting picture? I think the second is the most puzzling one for me. It's like trying to figure out what's happening in the second congressional district has been more perplexing than the others. The others I can kind of get my head around. The second district is a little bit trickier. So I don't know if my colleagues here have more insight on the second district, but as it relates to the first, I think Finkenauer, I would, but it's not going to be a cakewalk or anything else like that. It'll be close, but I would imagine Finkenauer will prevail. There's high Democratic enthusiasm. And I think you're seeing, I think you're going to see some growth in that split between the urban and rural in the first district. But I do think that more enthusiasm and a little bit more energies on that other side, and probably upside is more for Finkenauer. So,
okay. Dustin, how are you going to bet with Chris and Andrew's money? What on that race?
I don't know if I could bet on any of them, and I think to Chris's point, Andy mentioned this before too on the Polk County. I think the third district is probably the one I would take the bet on the easiest, just because those Polk County numbers, especially the absentee, are just really they're going to be. A lot of times, obviously, the vote comes in late on the Republican side on the day of the vote, but the numbers and the margins to overcome are going to be pretty substantial. And as Andy mentioned, back in the Leonard Boswell, Latham days, if you had a 40,000 vote margin in Polk County, it was lights out for a Democratic statewide candidate, and that's not what happened. On the first, Andy said this, so I'll do the same. Full disclosure, I've had to lobby both Abby and Ashley, and I like them both personally, and would consider them both friends. It really is a toss-up with obviously with a more Democratic favorable election. The incumbent, it probably has the advantage. What I would say is I think people were very interested to see what Congressman Finkenauer would do, just in part due to her age. And I think people have been very pleasantly surprised for the 2 years in her access and ability. And to Chris's point, I think in the recruitment, to have somebody that's been on TV for a number of years, I mean, was really smart for Ashley. So, you know, I think either of them would be really great in Washington, D.C., but I just think it just right now, with a Democratic likely favored election, the incumbent probably has an advantage.
Scott,
Andrew,
if
go
I
ahead.
Yeah, just one other thing that I would be remiss if I didn't say. I think despite the environment, something that I think is going to play very well for Ashley Hinson is she is an incredibly good candidate. I mean, I think if you talk to the National Republicans, they would tell you that she is in the top tier of their candidates nationwide.
Really? Good.
And frankly, candidates matter. Even in bad cycles, even in bad elections, the best candidate doesn't always win. But if I'm betting with Dustin's money, I'm going to want to bet on a better candidate if I can, which is just to say that I think Ashley is an exceptionally good candidate, and even if the environment is bad, Ashley is somebody that could turn that around.
Yeah, and this goes to Chris's point too on the second district. You know, I think Ashley feels really good about the numbers. You know, this is one of those. You know, it's whoever's ahead at the end, right? Is the prediction. And I think really this one is a toss-up to Andrew's point, just because of everything encompassed. I'm with Chris totally. The second district, I don't understand. You know, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was going to say this is because I said I'm a political junkie, and this is going to be the moderator. I'd love to hear each one of you take a minute or two on that Hart Miller Meeks. Dustin, a couple minutes, and we'll get back on track. But yeah, your thoughts.
I'll be brief. It just, you know, it's almost like Senator Miller Meeks's losses have played into her favor from a name recognition standpoint, which is typically not the case, because I think if you move over to the third district, you know, I think David losing last election is probably working against him. Here, with the years of Loebsack, you know, but the thing that I will say in betting, I would bet my own money, and Andy and I have talked about this, there's a couple Senate candidates, a couple House statewides down in Southeast Iowa. Southeast Iowa to me is trending far more Republican very quickly. So, you know, while it is interesting to me, you know, Tom Green lost last election, and with likely a little bit of money, there's a good chance that, you know, Senator Rich Taylor would have had a much tougher race and possibly lost as well. So Southeast Iowa is changing. So yeah, I'm with Chris that it is fascinating to me, but if that's what the movement is going on, and ultimately Andy and I are both information peddlers, and so he's heard the same things I have, that I'm hearing that Senator Miller Meeks is doing very well in the rumor mill, and you know, and maybe it's just that Southeast Iowa thing. But go ahead, Andy.
Okay. Yeah. Chris or Andy, go ahead.
I'll go ahead. This one's pretty straightforward for me. I think if you look at the territory in Southeast Iowa going up the river, I don't know if that's long-term Republican territory and it's transitioning that way, but I will tell you that's center of the strike zone for Donald Trump. And I think having President Trump on the ballot is really helping Senator Miller Meeks in that area, State Senator Miller Meeks. And I think you see it in terms of, to Dustin's point, you see it in the state races. I mean, I think I think Rich Taylor, senator from Henry County, is going to have a tough go of it here this cycle. Senator Tom Green, who is in Burlington, a Republican in Burlington, isn't running for re-election, but I think there's a reasonable chance that Republicans are going to hold that seat. I just think that's a really, really Trumpy area. And I think having President Trump on the ballot is going to help. And when you think about it, when you think about the people who are starting to turn away from President Trump, you know, those are people who, those are like women who live in the suburbs. A lot of the folks who are kind of that blue collar, white, middle-aged, not necessarily high education group isn't turning away from President Trump and in as big a numbers. And I think are probably going to hold pretty firm.
Chris, your thoughts on that, again, on that race, Miller Meeks?
Yeah, A couple of things. I guess one is I agree. If you, like I said before, if you look at some of the district, if you just take like all the river counties across, there's only a couple in which Democrats have been able to kind of keep or slightly expand a registration advantage. In fact, Republicans have closed the gaps in all of those, almost all of those counties along the river, but especially to the point that has been made in Southeast. So I think that's definitely a contributor here. I think a couple of other things. One, I think unlike Ashley Hinson, who I think is a quality, it was a good find or not a good find, a good recruit for the Republicans. I'm less confident in Rita Hart's candidacy in terms of kind of how she's been able to hit the stump and connect. She maybe even though she's run for statewide office, hasn't the same name recognition in the rest. And I don't know, that race has been pretty flat, I think, on her side, just looking at the dynamics of it. And so I think that's part of it. And I do wonder, given the demographics of the district and the COVID time we're in, whether or not that traditional vote, related to college and university vote is not the same effect this time around, one reason or another, as it has been sometimes in previous races in the second district. So I would echo most of these, and I'd also add kind of candidate quality in that dynamic. I think that there are some trends there that are probably good for the Republicans. So despite a kind of negative environment, or more negative environment, or tougher environment, generally speaking.
Okay, thank you. Chris, I'm going to start with you this question. It's the morning of November 4th, 2020. Will we know the outcome of the election?
I tend to, yeah, okay. Here's what I would say is that Florida, North Carolina, for instance, will be pretty quick. Ohio will be pretty quick. Iowa's numbers will be pretty quick compared to other states in terms of them coming in. So looking at those states, I think if we're getting those numbers and they're trending one direction or the other, then yes, we'll know. If it's a mix, so for instance, Florida goes for Trump, but North Carolina goes for Biden or something in some way, I think that'll be a longer road. And Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, states we've talked a lot about today, they're likely to take longer. Now, the difficult bit is I do think we'll have more information than simply just the actual final votes or the unverified vote, right? So we will have more information. Will it be enough for, I think the tendencies now is going to be for the networks and the rest to kind of go the other direction and avoid kind of early calls and things like that. So I do think that we will know the margins, and we'll probably know the ballot percentages, mail-in versus election day, or what's remaining potentially in absentee ballots. And the way this election is breaking is really fascinating in terms of the mode of voting. If you look at Democrats, they're voting, and they're enthusiastically voting early vote or in-person or mail-in voting, whereas Republicans, it's very much the election day. And depending on the way the states count and when they process the votes and when they tabulate them, that will have an impact. So I do think we'll have a lot of information. So will we know the exact shakedown? Probably not, but will we have a strong suspicion of where it's going? I think so. But that strong suspicion could be it's a mix. So I don't think that's a hedged answer, but it's sort of a hedged answer. I think you look for early on states like Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Arizona will be pretty quick too once the polls close. So going into the night. So if those states are going in one direction, we will, I think, have a better sense.
Okay. Andrew, are we gonna know the morning of November 4th?
So Chris actually stole a lot of my answer to this question. I think really, we're going to get early results in Florida, North Carolina, and Ohio. If Joe Biden wins all three of those, we're probably going to know that night, and it's probably going to be pretty decisive. I think if Trump wins all three, it's going to be a late deal, because I think then you end up in a situation where the election is going to come down in large part to Arizona, which isn't going to which to Chris's point is going to report quickly, but not until they close, which is going to be in the middle of the night here in Iowa. And then we're going to have to wait for Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania to get sorted out. And that if it's close, that could take a while and could be pretty contentious.
Dustin, your thoughts? Are we going to know November 4th?
Yeah, I'd agree with these guys. I think Florida is the big key to watch. I mean, just the current real clear politics average right now is +9 in Florida. You know, so if I don't think that's true, but if Biden can win Florida pretty decisively, that just makes the mechanics of the math very difficult, unless President Trump can hold those 3, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. When you start playing around with electoral map, losing that, you know, Biden's put a bunch of money into Ohio in the past couple of weeks. I just think Ohio looks a lot like Iowa, and I just think it's too far afield. But with the numbers where Florida is, if that flips, or to those guys' point, to Andy and Chris as well, if you see Ohio, Florida, and North Carolina, or a mixture of 2 of the 3, then I think we're going to know pretty certain, just because the math is very tricky from there.
One thing, if I can add really quickly, is one thing that people should be prepared for on election night is if they're really junkies like you, Scott, have said you are, and you're always refreshing your screen or doing all that kind of stuff, or multi-screens. Don't be surprised if you see really strange or funky like drops in votes. So depending on how a state counts their absentee, given that we know there's going to be such a big split between Democrats and Republicans, when batches of votes come in, depending on where that batch is coming from, but also is it mail-in or is it not? So you're going to see sometimes there'll be these weird spikes and things like that. So geographically know where they're from, but also know what type of ballot type. So which I think is going to be an interesting thing, given this real split in the mode of voting that we're seeing.
Okay. Chris kind of touched on it, but one question I did want to ask, and I'll start with you, Dustin, on this one. Mail-in voting has seemed to become a highly debated topic. How will mail-in voting have a decisive impact on federal elections, on Iowa elections?
Well, let me just add, I think the first thing, and Andy and Chris would agree, is I think there's a lot of confusion over what the controversy is. I think really
Agreed.
the issue that is the controversial one is there are some states, and Iowa is not one of them, where you send unsolicited absentee ballots. That's the controversial part, you know, and even the president himself and a lot of people around him have done absentee where you request. But I just think this is one of those things like death taxes and defund the police, whatever, you know, you want. It's one of these kind of ring the bell sorts of things. People are okay with mail-in ballots so long as, you know, it's a secured way where somebody requests them. But I will say, to me, a mail-in ballot is going to have, much like everything we've faced since March, what happens with the vote because of COVID is going to be fascinating. You know, I'd be interested in spending some more time with Andy and us talking with people that we know that are campaigning, the impact of COVID on just campaigning. But I think on the mail-in ballot side is, are you really going to see the historic trend of Republicans showing up to the polls in person? Or, you know, if it's a demographic that's older, are they going to be fearful? Now, I live in a very small town. I can tell you that there aren't a lot of mitigation measures taken. People aren't that scared. I mean, it's kind of a acceptance of risk. So I could see in my hometown that people wouldn't have a problem going to the polls. But I don't know how that's going to play out in an older generation when you get towards November. So that's where I think it's going to be of interest.
Yeah, Andrew, your thought on the mail-in issue?
Yeah, I think to dovetail on Dustin's point, I would also add that the other piece of the controversy is when you can send the ballot and have it still be counted. When does it have to be postmarked? Does the ballot have to be postmarked by election day, or are states going to count whatever comes in the door? That's an issue in Nevada. and could end up being a complicating factor as we get into some votes in closer states. So that's on my mind. The other piece from a mail-in voting perspective that's on my mind is if you look at some of the races that happened over the summer, some of the primary races, like some of the congressional races in New York that were done primarily by vote by mail, particularly for voters who aren't used to doing this, there were errors. For example, folks didn't sign their envelopes, and those votes were tossed. I think if we see situations where people are sending in ballots incorrectly in some of these states, you could see a high number of these not counted, not included in the overall count relative to the number of votes that are counted from folks who show up in person. And I think that may end up being an issue in some of these states, particularly if they're close. But back to our previous question, if we see a situation where one or the other candidate is starting to run up a pretty big lead, maybe it won't be as big of an issue, and we have a winner on election night.
Chris, your thoughts on that, on mail-in?
Yeah, just real quick. I think this notion, sometimes people will hear this idea of spoilage rate. So that goes to Andrew's point about mistakes. And so a person's ballot's spoiled. Whereas if you're in person, it's going to spit it, like in Iowa, the optical scanner will spit it back out to you in most cases, and then you can just fill out another ballot. So that's going to happen. I think the good news is that I think, like many things, Iowa gets this right. I think Iowa's mail-in ballot system and its election system, and I would even throw in its redistricting system, is a model, and it works well. So I think Iowa, we're not going to see these issues with mail-in ballots. Will it make a difference? Of course, it provides people a way to deal with concerns about COVID and other things. So I don't think we're going to have the problems that a couple of other states might have, like Andrew is, because as Dustin mentioned, what was mailed out to people in Iowa was an application. So you have to take that affirmative step, and there's ballot tracking. So if anybody in the audience has filled out their ballot and submitted it, that there's a tracking mechanism for it. You can see that it's been received. And my understanding is, I think it's the Saturday before the election, the canvassing boards will be allowed to open them and separate them out, the ballot from the envelope, and then get them ready to be processed. So my understanding in Iowa is you're going to see the count for mail-ins largely included in that batch that we're going to be getting on election day. So Iowa seems to run this pretty well, frankly. So Secretary Pate's office, as well as the auditors across the state, I think this is an area where Iowans watching television may fret about what's happening in other states, but I wouldn't worry so much about the mail-in ballot in the state of Iowa. So.
Okay, I'd like to, thank you, Chris. I'd like to take the last few minutes we have to talk about local races. And so, Chris, I'm going to start with you. Can you provide some analysis and prediction on some of the state races? And for those that, for our audience, we have Pam Yoakum versus Jennifer Smith as candidate, incumbent Shannon Lundgren versus Ryan Quinn, Andy McKeon versus Dr. Stephen Bradley, and then Lindsey James versus Pauline Chilton. So I'll let you start wherever you want, Chris.
Right. Well, I'll take running down. It's always difficult in a sense because sometimes in these smaller races, there's local things that you might not even be aware of necessarily, right? Especially since all of our kind of time is spent thinking about these national things. But based upon kind of what I've observed and also trends, I would. For me, Senator Yoakum will be reelected. It's hard to see Yoakum being unseated there, especially in Dubuque, which I think there is a sense that while it has shifted from its Democratic, there are some weakening of its Democratic connections. This is a high enthusiasm election. This is likely to be good for Democratic incumbents in the city, for instance. So. Senator Yoakum, I think Shannon Lundgren, that area has certainly trended in her favor, and I think will continue to do so. The only tricky bit, I suppose, would be some of the suburban areas there, but in Piasta and the rest. But the reality is, I think that's not going to be an issue for her. So I would expect Representative Lundgren to be reelected, and then Lindsey James as well. I think Lindsey's been a very active campaigner. I think she's kind of made a name for herself, especially amongst kind of progressive circles and the rest, and has been a kind of face in Dubuque, pretty common face in Dubuque. So I think she will be reelected with some ease. And then I guess the tougher one, I suppose, is House District 58, which probably Dustin and Andrew can provide a little bit more for. I mean, that one's an interesting race, if nothing else, because of the candidate and change of party and the rest. But that district is not unaware of that kind of thing, because that's happened before in that district.
Right.
So I guess I would go with McCain, just because I'd go with the incumbents on all of these. And the 58 is the toughest one for me to kind of get my head around. I suppose I just looked at it as from the standpoint of, let's say you have a floor of 40%-ish of Democrats. If he can drip off some of that Republican vote based upon his name recognition, and he is pretty likable and the rest, then he can survive this. And money wise, he seems to have done pretty well. So just looking at
Andrew,
finance.
I'm sorry, Kurt.
Yeah.
Andrew, your thoughts? Yep.
Yeah, I have a couple. First of all, I would just add that Trump won that district 57-37. So if 2020 looks anything like 2016, at least you're going to have that presidential headwind. It's not necessarily determinative, but it's not something that you'd choose if you could. The other thing I would add is that I think Republicans feel like they have a really strong candidate. It's a seat that they really want to win. And I think there are going to be a lot of resources, on the final analysis spent on trying to pick it up and bring it back to the House Republicans. I think we haven't really talked a lot about the House kind of from a global perspective, but I would say that the House Republicans have a 4-seat majority. There are a ton of resources being spent on the House, and part of the Republican strategy is to play offense and try and pick up some seats in areas where they think they can, and that's part of their strategy for mitigating this what's going to be a tough election for those guys. And so this is one of those seats that they're trying to play offense and try and pick up.
And do you feel in the other races, Andrew, the Yoakum, Lundgren, James? Okay.
I couldn't agree with Chris more.
Yeah, Dustin, your thoughts on the local races?
Yeah, the only, since we're limited on time, the only thing I would add is, I would agree on the Yoakum James races. The only thing I would add, and Andy and I talk about this a lot, despite everything we've all gone over as far as the national impact, these races still, the local candidate matters. And with what Shannon and what Andy are in their community, I would have a hard time betting against them. That's not always the case in every district, but Andy's been around a long time. Shannon is well known within the district. So on a local race, Andy and I could talk about some Des Moines races where the two of us agree wholeheartedly that you can pour as much money as you want. The numbers are completely flipped. But that, if somebody's been known and well known in a community for 20 or 30 years, it matters. I would put the advantage to the incumbents, just simply because them locally, it matters.
And I know we've only got a couple minutes, but again, moderator question more. Does partisanship play in a lot? And I'll start with you, Dustin. Does partisanship play in to these local races, or is it that local person?
It's more and more. I think you really saw a shift in the mid 90s, towards more hyper partisan stuff at the national level. Those sorts of things have then trickled down, Hastert rules and little kind of inside baseball things that have happened. Still in Iowa, I think it matters that our desks, that the legislators' desks are on the floor next to one another.
Sure.
If you go up to Wisconsin, right, like people have office buildings and they're separated. So there still is the Iowa nice aspect, but Andy will tell you, just we're around the Capitol a lot. It's pretty amazing sometimes that two people from a party don't talk, from different parties have never talked to one another, even in the same chamber. Is pretty fascinating. And honestly, guys like Tim Kaputsian walking away, guys like that could cross the aisle and had friendships and that. You know, those are the folks that I kind of trend to working with, because it isn't just hyper ideological. It's soaking down into the local stuff more and more, but we're still Iowans and people still work together.
Chris, would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, no, I would. I think that especially at the local races, so this idea, and that's kind of why I went with all the incumbents as well, is that you know, I think that the impact has increased for partisanship across, even downward, but it still tails off once you get that kind of localized, especially with somebody who has kind of those personal connections. And I would say that, you know, the whether it's the desks or the rest or just a cultural thing, it is something that's, I think, beneficial to the state. I do think it's under pressure. And whether it's candidates leaving who are that kind of disposed to working across the aisle, I do worry about what it's going to look like 10 years from now. I think we are seeing a kind of drift. The less Iowa follows the national trend, I think that's probably better on these kind of issues. So I prefer to keep things a little bit more like we've seen in the past. But
Andrew, we're kind of running out of time, but your thoughts too
Yep.
on the partisanship.
Yeah, quickly. On the political side, less of what's going on in the Capitol when session starts, and more just on the political side. I think Dustin and Chris are right for the most part, but I will also say it's important to note that Iowa is susceptible to national waves. In 2010, during that national wave, Republicans picked up a ton of seats. In 2016, Republicans retook the state Senate for the first time in years and years and years. In 2018, it was a national trend towards the Ds, and the Ds picked up a fair number of particularly House seats. And in all of those elections, good office holders who work well with their community lost. And so we're still a state that's susceptible to the national waves, and that's still a piece of this puzzle too.
And Scott, let me add one quick thing to end for you. You know, I think all of us are clamoring to find the reasonable people in the middle. You know, and I think social media and 24-hour, you know, I don't even call them news. It's entertainment, but I don't think the electorate really grasps that. Whether you watch Fox News or MSNBC, it's entertainment that they have to fill. And it's making it worse and worse. So I made a joke with a friend yesterday, and I just said, you know, I want to go back to a world where if you drive your car into a group of people, I don't care what party you're part of, or if you burn someone's business down, I don't care what party you're part of, you know, it's bad. And, you know, I think most people are there. It's just we have these new tools that are just fomenting more and more. So to Chris's point, if Iowa can continue to be Iowa, we'd all be a much better society.
Yeah. Andrew, Chris, Dustin, thank you so much. Thank you, Dubuque Chamber, for putting this on. Molly, I'll let you jump in.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, gentlemen. On behalf of the Dubuque Area Chamber of Commerce and, of course, our sponsors that help make this possible, Statera Integrated Health, Anderson Window and Door. We also have IMON Communications and, of course, the Friedman Group and our facilitator today, Mr. Scott D'Souza. Our guests, our panelists, thank you so much. We're 3 weeks away from Election Day, 21 days from today. I encourage everyone to do the most important exercise in our democracy, vote. Thank you. Have a wonderful day. It's a beautiful Tuesday in Dubuque, Iowa, and be safe and be well. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.